Dear friends, welcome to Think BRICS. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Fabiano Escher, a Brazilian political economist and researcher specializing in agrarian capitalism, food regimes, and the global south. He is the author of The BRICS and Global Agri-Food System, a forthcoming book that promises to be a landmark study on how the agricultural histories of China, Russia, Brazil, and India are reshaping the future of global capitalism and world food processing politics. His work arrives at a critical moment as the global food order fractures and supply chains are weaponized. The BRICS are no longer just emerging markets. They are becoming active organizers of a new world. And agriculture, that most elemental foundation of civilization, is right at the center of it. Professor Escher, welcome to Think BRICS.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with the first question about your book. Your book opens with a striking claim. Let me read it. The civilization built on neoliberal globalization has collapsed, and the end of cheap food since 2008 is one of the key fault lines. From the food price spikes of 2008, 2011, through COVID, to the war in Ukraine and the current crisis in the Middle East, how has food become a front line of geopolitical conflict?
Thanks for the question. Well, food has become the front line of geopolitical conflict because the age of cheap food was never simply an economic fact. It was a political settlement. It depended on cheap energy, cheap credit, cheap transport, cheap labor, ecological frontiers, open trade routes, and mainly the belief that global markets could provision societies better than the states could do. What has broken down is not only or was not only the food price stability, but the confidence that a liberalized world food order can guarantee social stability, national security, political legitimacy. The food price shocks of 2008 and 2011 were the first major warning. They showed that when food prices rise sharply, governments do not treat food as just another commodity, a simple commodity. They release stocks, cut tariffs, impose price controls, restrict exports, expand subsidies, and defend domestic consumers. In other words, food is immediately repoliticized. And that is why I argue that the end of cheap food marks a deeper rupture. Food is one of the materials foundations of civilization. When it becomes unstable, the relation between economy, society, and nature comes under pressure. COVID intensified this. The pandemic did not create the fragility of the global food system, but exposed it brutally. Then the war in Ukraine made the geopolitical dimension impossible to ignore. Russia and Ukraine are central to global wheat, maize, sunflower oil, fertilizers, energy, and Black Sea corridors. In the Middle East, for example, Gaza, food, water, land, humanitarian access, and infrastructure have become part of the conflict itself. It's been awfully destroyed. In the Red Sea with Iran, the security affect freight losses, energy prices, shipping routes, and strategic choke points. So let's follow the chain of causation. A shock in the Black Sea affects bread prices in North Africa. A conflict in the Red Sea affects trade all over between Asia, Europe, Africa. Higher energy prices affect fertilizers. Fertilizers affect planting decisions. Planting decisions affect a future harvest. Food systems are globalized, but political authority remains fragmented on the other hand. So the BRICS are central because they are not merely passive victims of this fractured world order. They are organizers, mediators, and sometimes the beneficiaries of it. China treats food security as a national sovereignty through reserves, production targets, strategic imports. India relies on public distribution and subsidized grain. Brazil, on the other hand, my country, has combined agribusiness export power with an anti-hunger politics, anti-poverty policies, school meals, public procurement. Russia is perhaps the most interesting case. After the trauma of the 90s, it rebuilt agricultural capacities and became a leading wheat export, as we all know, gaining a geopolitical leverage with it. So to finish my answer, I would say that food is not being simply weaponized, although that can be true. But the deeper point is that food has become strategic because the neoliberal promise of automatic market provisioning no longer commands confidence. People don't believe it anymore. The old order treated food as a commodity governed by global markets. The emerging order treats foods as an infrastructure of sovereignty, social reproduction, and even of geopolitical influence. That is why agriculture and food are no longer secondary issues in world politics. They are a decisive terrain on which the future of global capitalism and multipolarity will be fought.
Thank you. Your book argues that to understand today's capitalism in Brazil and Russia, in China and in India, you have to go back to their agricultural histories, their land regimes, peasant structures, and rural class relations. Can you give us an example, a concrete example of how a country's agrarian past is still shaping its economic model today?
Yes, I can. Thank you for the question again. Well, I could give you examples from any of these countries or even relations between countries like Brazil and China, for
Yeah,
example,
please.
which has a very important soy meat complex. But I will enjoy the opportunity and speak a little bit about Russia. I think it's a very good example. It's a strong case. If you want to understand Russian capitalism today, we cannot begin in 91 as if capitalism simply arrived out of the blue with market reform and the collapse of Soviet Union. We have to look deeper in its agrarian history. Take, for example, the late Tsarist period. Russia was already a major grain power at that moment. It's very famous that the finance minister Vishnegradsky, if my Russian is correct, told that we shall undereat, but we will export. So it exported grain on huge scale, which mattered for the balance of payments, state revenue, and industrialization. But this was not the result of broad capitalist transformation in the countryside. The agrarian transition in Russia remained limited at that time. It was a transition from above, marked by poor peasant households, low productivity, weak domestic demand, and a state trying to mobilize agriculture for national power and military expansion. So one long Russian pattern begins here. Agriculture is not simply a private economic sector. It is tied to state formation, geopolitical ambition, social control. This continues through the Soviet era. Through forced collectivization, agriculture became a mechanism for transferring surplus from agriculture to industrialization. The what you call the kolkhozy and sovkhozy were not only farms; they were institutions of production, employment, welfare, food access, territorial control. They helped build Russia and the whole Soviet Union as an industrial power, but at an enormous human cost and with persistent inefficiencies. And this produced a paradox. The Soviet Union was a superpower, but from the 70s and 80s, it increasingly relied on grain imports, especially from the US, to sustain livestock production and meet urban consumers' expectations with the so-called Soviet social contract. So food dependence was therefore experienced not only as an economic inconvenience, but as a strategic vulnerability. And that became more brutal with the 90s catastrophe. Sorry. The post-Soviet reforms dismantled the collective and state farms, but they did not create, how could I call it, an European style of family farming sector. The shock therapy disorganized production, rural infrastructure, welfare provision, food access, agricultural output collapsed, imports increased, many households survived through self-provisioning in small plots. So the memory of the 90s is essential for understanding contemporary Russia. And the changes Putin has promoted are, let's say, are a direct response to that trauma. It centralized state capacities, trade, strengthened large corporate farms, supported import substitution, and connected agriculture to the wider national security and sovereignty. Now, the main actor in Russian agribusiness are the so-called Agri-Holdings, They are large, horizontally and vertically integrated groups, often connected to finance, processing, logistics, retail, and export channels. They are not a return to Soviet collective agriculture. One of the main expectations of that past, that a large-scale agriculture supported by the state would be the backbone of national food security. This is why Russia transformation from an import dependence to wheat export power is not just a market success history. It's a reorganization of capitalism around a state-backed agrarian capacity. Since 2014, sanctions and counter-sanctions accelerated this pattern. The food embargo, import substitution, support for domestic firms, there's Agri-Holdings, and orientation towards exports like to China, to Turkey, to the Middle East, North Africa, turn agriculture for Russia in a geopolitical asset. Agriculture is the domain where the state, large-scale production, territorial control, and international power intersect. Just to finish, today, Russian capitalism, I would say, is not just about oil and gas platforms and the military industrial complex. It also has an agri-food dimension, an agri-food power, with corridors, fertilizers, Black Sea logistics, agri-holdings, food security policy, and even in diplomacy. Everything of it is now part of Russia's insertion in the world economy and politics. The broader point is that agrarian history do not disappear. They become sedimented in institutions, property relations, state capacity, and even political common sense. In Russia, the central question has remained remarkably persistent. How can a state mobilize land, labor, grain, infrastructure to secure sovereignty in a very hostile international environment as we live today? That is why Russia is such a powerful case. It shows that the agrarian question is still, so to say, alive in the 21st century.
Thank you. You know very well, you studied very well the Russian case, but now it's my turn to ask you about Brazilian case, because behind the scenes we mentioned Professor Nikulin, whom I had an honor to talk to about agriculture in BRICS, and he told me that Russia and Brazil have lots in common about the organization, like the vision of agriculture. You mentioned that in Russia we have huge Agri-Holdings who produces, sells, distribution, logistics integrated, and the same is in Brazil, right?
Yeah, it's similar, but similar results with different histories, I would say, because different than Russia, we didn't have a revolution or a collectivization. We always had let's say, a capitalist model in agriculture, even since, let's say, late 19th century. The main sector of our economy was coffee exports. And then when the crisis of 29 happened, the coffee economy broke down, and Brazil entered a process of mass industrialization in the 30s. It followed straight through the 50s, 60s. By the 60s, it faced what we call import substitution industrialization, enter in a moment of, let's say, calming down. Import substitution was losing traction, and politically Brazil was in a turmoil, and it happened in 64, a coup d'etat here, a military coup. During the first 4 years, it was a very, very complicated economy. Was stagnated, political repression and everything. But since the mid 60s, they started to launch very strong agricultural policies with rural credit, rural extension, agricultural research, credit lines from the Brazilian bank. And so the proposal of the left beforehand was to promote agrarian reform as the solution for inflation, food inflation, and all these problems. But the dictatorship was allied with the landowners, so they did not give sequence to the idea of land reform. Instead, they supported what we call the conservative modernization of agriculture. They made a technical change in agriculture and livestock production. They built huge agro-industrial complexes, similar to what you call in Russia today agri-holdings, and not state-owned, privately owned mostly. And also the multinational agribusiness companies came into Brazil at the time. Some of them were already here. And then in the 90s, when neoliberal globalization came together with democratization in Brazil, because our democratization process instead in 85, these two things converged, and we had at the time, let's say, an exchange crisis, a currency crisis. And the way to give a response in terms of balance of payments was to promote agribusiness export. And so the modern model of large scale farms with very high tech, capital intensive, fewer jobs, high use of pesticides, all these things become entrenched since the 90s. And they are a huge agro export power today, especially soybeans.
Yeah.
And where China is our main market source. Yeah.
In China and in India, correct me if I'm wrong, the structure of agribusiness is absolutely different in respect to Russia and Brazil. They do not have so many agri holdings like we call here. The small farmers prevailing. Am I right?
Yes, you're right.
The structure of agricultural business and agricultural activity in general in BRICS countries are very different.
Very
From
different.
China to Russia, from Brazil to India, they are absolutely nothing in common, I think.
Yeah, I would say I would not say nothing, but
Less,
very not so much in
not
common
so
indeed.
much in common.
Yeah, I would say Russia and Brazil have more like dual structures because I mean the export complexes are dominated by large scale farming, but we also have a huge family farming sector, both in Brazil and Russia. Yeah, in Russia you call it the subsidiary farming. Yeah, I think I don't remember the Russian word for that. But very small farming, tiny farms. But the huge majority of the people living in rural areas. Here in Brazil, we also have a huge and heterogeneous family farming sector, which are the majority of the, let's say, the agricultural holdings. But they have, let's say, here in Brazil, less than 25% of the land, although they are more than 75% of the holdings.
Yeah.
Russia is similar.
It's similar,
Yeah,
yeah.
while while in India and China is different. But even among the two, China and India, there are differences. Both are family household based agriculture, peasant based, I would say. And however, I would say that in India, the agri-industrial complexes are very incipient. They call the food industry is dominant in the unorganized sector, while in China, the agricultural primary agricultural production is family based, but the agro-industrial system is very well developed. They have input processing industries. They have food processing industries. They have a huge trading companies. They have huge technology companies that all provide for the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector is modern but family based. Yeah, different than India, which is more complicated.
The BRICS together, if we take all BRICS countries, control roughly 45 to 50% of global grain production and 42% of the world's arable land in total. And as we see, they do not have common agricultural policy. Is this structural gap a weakness, or can the sheer weight of their combined food and land power reshape the global system anyway? What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I think the discussion we just had helped to to clarify the structural differences among the countries. But the basic point you made is correct. The BRICS, they represent a huge share of the world population, land, fresh water, food production, fertilizers, grain trade, consumer demand. I don't know exactly the numbers here, but the real question is whether the material weight can become institutional power for these countries. And my answer is yes, but unevenly, and not through a common agricultural policy. The BRICS are not the European Union. They do not have a common agricultural budget, subsidy regime, sanitary rules, food reserves, or even a supranational authority able to discipline national policies. Given these differences, I do not expect anything like a BRICS common agricultural policy like in Europe. See, China, for example, it is a huge importer with a state-centered food security strategy. Russia, in turn, is a major wheat and fertilizers exporter. Brazil is an agribusiness powerhouse, especially in soy, maize, meat, sugar, coffee. India is a giant producer, but also a country where food prices, public procurement, subsidies, farmers' politics are explosive. South Africa, in its turn, plays a smaller but important role in regional food markets in Africa, in Southern Africa, I would say. Uh, these interests are diverse and do not automatically converge because exporters and importers don't want the same thing. Large agribusiness and small family farmers don't want the same thing. Countries concerned with food inflation and countries concerned with export revenues have different priorities, right? So the lack of coordination is real. It limits the BRICS' ability to act as a unified agricultural bloc, stabilize grain prices, manage reserves, or replace the Western dominated institutions in food governance. Yeah, but this is just half of the story, and then here is the key thing, the main argument of my book, which is that the BRICS are not transforming the global food regime by acting as a single bloc. They are transforming it through their different development trajectories. Their power comes from the fact that each occupies a strategic position in the global agri-food system. China, for example, transforms markets through demand reserves, state-owned enterprises like COFCO, infrastructure finance, and sourcing strategies like here in Brazil for soybeans. Russia does so through wheat, fertilizers, Black Sea and Eurasian corridors, and food security diplomacy. Brazil does so through soy, meat, land frontiers, logistics, and competitive agribusiness exports, and also protection of its family farming. India does so through rice, public stocks, domestic distribution, and the political weight of farmers, which have protested over the last years, and also the huge consumer market. So even without a common agricultural policy, the BRICS reshape the agri-food system because global markets have to adjust to their national decisions. So in the book, I argue that the BRICS are not merely objects of the food regimes. They are organizers of change from within, but they organize this change unevenly. The broader context in which they are organizing is what Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci called an interregnum. Yeah, the moment when the old is dying and the new cannot be born yet. A moment when Western hegemony is weakened, but a new stable order still has to replace it. It's not not come yet. So in this context, the BRICS do not abolish the old, yet they pluralize it. They make it more polycentric. Let me just say a word about the BRICS grain exchange,
please,
which is a good example. It is, which I have not explored so much in the book, but I have some words to say. It is not a common agricultural policy, not even a fully, let's say, functioning alternative to Chicago or London. But politically, it is significant because it shows an attempt to move away from material weight to institutional power. If the BRICS are major producers, consumers, importers, and exporters of grains and fertilizers, why should price discovery, settlement, insurance, risk management, commodity benchmarks, quality remain so dependent on Western-dominated institutions? Why we don't have a say about that? Of course, there are obstacles to build this voice: liquidity, trust, quality standards, national currencies, currency exchange, infrastructure, competition with other exchanges, and even the divergent interests between importers and exporters within the BRICS. Yeah, as we told. So I would not exaggerate the importance of the BRICS grain exchange, because in the years to come, it may remain partial. But even as a project, it reveals a vision, a direction. The BRICS are not building a single agricultural status. They are not a bloc, but they are building parallel, partial, flexible institutions to expand, thereby gaining space. Their power lies less in unity than in a strategic, how to say, indispensability. We cannot think about world agricultural trade without thinking the role of the BRICS. So yes, there is a coordination gap. There is no unified common policy, but it does not neutralize their influence. The BRICS, despite this coordination gap, they can reshape the global food system, because the food regime itself is becoming more fragmented, geopolitical, and polycentric. So the BRICS are the normal condition for treating this situation in this critical conjuncture we are living in.
Thank you. We see that BRICS countries do not have common agricultural politics. They are not an institutionalized bloc entity, and etc. But do the BRICS have a shared food sovereignty doctrine? How do you think? Or each country is simply playing its own? What I'm intended to say, because Russia, as you correctly told, from being in 90s was a wheat importer, now it became exporter, one of the biggest exporters today. China's 15th 5-year plan puts food self-sufficiency as its core. So how do you see this in general? What about Brazil? What about India? Do BRICS countries have shared food sovereignty doctrine? How do you think?
I would not say that the BRICS have a shared food sovereignty doctrine in a strong sense. Each country has let's say, each country has playing
its own game.
But yeah, playing its own game. But these games are not unrelated to each other. There is a common direction. The idea that food security is increasingly understood as part of national sovereignty, of geopolitical autonomy, and of state power. And here, to make clear what we mean by food security or food sovereignty doctrine, is useful to distinguish between two current meanings of the food sovereignty concept. It's controversial. On the one side, you have the social movement sense expressed by La Via Campesina, and here in Brazil by the MST, the movement of the landless workers. For them, food sovereignty means a democratic control over land, production, markets, diets, ecological reproduction for the people, not for the state. In that sense, the BRICS do not have a shared food sovereignty project. In many cases, the privileges of large corporations and state-backed agribusiness, like in Brazil and in Russia, and even in China to some extent, are strengthened at the expense of peasants, of small farmers, of rural workers, of indigenous populations. So in this sense, we are not food sovereign in the sense of the social movements. But in a geopolitical sense, which is the sense that predominates, for example, in Russia agricultural policy, food sovereignty means that means like a state capacity to secure domestic supply, to reduce vulnerability to hostile powers, to control strategic commodities, to use food, fertilizers, logistics, market access as instruments of power through a national state-centered policy. So in this sense, China and Russia are decisive. Russia has used food power as means to become a geopolitical power because it was like weak since the 90s, and actually the whole Soviet history, as we already discussed, was not really a success story. But since Putin, things have changed dramatically, and even there is in Russia today, some years ago, there was an interview by Dmitry Medvedev in which he spoke about food for Russia as a silent weapon, which was actually becoming more important in exports than real weapons. I mean, he told that before the Ukraine conflict, but at that time it was real. The numbers were bigger in food export than in real weapons export. But not because Russia necessarily stops its agricultural export to create famine in another country. On the other case is real because Russia grain and its fertilizers are indispensable for many countries. Even in Brazil, I think more than 80% of the fertilizers we import come from outside. Yeah, fertilizers, and especially from Russia. Yeah, if I could go on, if you allow me. For example, China. China
it's
even
about China.
It's more nuanced. China is different because it's not a primary food exporter as Brazil or Russia. It's a giant producer. It's the biggest agricultural country in the world, but it is also a giant importer, especially of soybeans, feed grains, meat, and several inputs. So meat. Yeah, like in the case of Brazil, they import a lot of beef. I think they are beginning to import chicken from Russia.
And pork. Pork meat.
Pork too. Yeah. So the Chinese food power operates through demand. They're huge demand.
Huge population.
And they have huge population with a relatively high income standards. So they are a huge demand source for the world. And China have an important agricultural policy of stockpiles. They have reserves. They have procurement policies. They have created their own standards. They had huge infrastructures. They have finance. They have a diversification of supply sources. So China food sovereignty strategy is not about autarky. It's a control interdependence with world market. The state seeks basically self-sufficiency in staples like cereals, corn, wheat, and rice, while using global markets selectively for feed, for proteins, for oil seeds, for meat. And this is why food security remains central in this late 5-year plan, because they have grain output targets. They have how to say that arable land protection targets, red lines they call it. They have new seed technologies. Now the ChemChina bought Syngenta. They have research in smart agriculture, in lab meat, in alternative proteins. They have a rural development policy they call the rural revitalization. So I would say, for example, Russia is stronger on the sport and the export side, while China is strong in the import and coordination side. While Russia say, you need our grains and fertilizers, China would say, you need access to our markets, to our finance, to our infrastructure, and to our demand.
Yeah.
You think about Brazil and India, on the other hand, different than China and Russia.
different but similar, because India also have a huge population, young population, growing population, and they do want eat. They need rice, they need soybeans, they need meat. Here is Brazil with its export.
Yeah, you're right. It's different but similar, complementary, so to say. But the point, for example, I mean, in this process of transforming the international food regime, Russia and China have a more like, how can I put it, rule setting position, while India and Brazil are more like followers or rule adapters, so to say. Brazil, for example, its food power comes from agribusiness competitiveness in soy, maize, meat, sugar, coffee, logistics, ports, the Cerrado frontiers, the Amazon protection. But Brazil usually uses this power more pragmatically. Brazil, on the one hand, it wants market access in China, which is now its main demand source, but it also wants trade with Europe. It wants bargaining power in the WTO, where Russia was ousted today, don't have a say anymore, and it wants room to combine exports on the one hand of the agribusiness large scale sector with anti-hunger, anti-poverty, family farming policies at home. India is also a follower with a much stronger, let's say, domestic food security state, because a larger part of the population lives in a poverty situation. So they have this huge public distribution system, which is with its competency is to provide public procurement, minimum support prices, grain stocks to maintain political stability in the country. So the Food Corporation of India, it operates, for example, export bans on rice or wheat that affect global markets. But its priority is domestic legitimacy, because they basically want or need to feed their population and contain food inflation. So my answer, South Africa is a similar case, more like domestic consumption oriented. So my answer would be to finish the response. No, the BRICS, they do not have a shared food sovereignty doctrine, but they share a historical lesson. Let's say China and Russia are the challengers, as they turn food security into geopolitical leverage, while Brazil, India, and South Africa, they are followers and adapters. They use food policy to defend bargaining space, domestic stability, and even regional influence. That's why food sovereignty has become strategic. It is not only about feeding populations, because no serious state can leave food entirely to the market. It is about who controls the infrastructure of survival in a world so fractured as this one we are living in today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very deep insight, very deep discussion we have today. And I see that we can continue for hours to, to talk about agricultural policy in BRICS countries in general and in each country separately. And I hope our viewers finds today's interview interesting. And for the next time, we'll prepare some questions for you, Professor. And for today, let me continue, but with the last question. And I invite you to change a little bit the position and to watch from another angle on agriculture and BRICS. So we are living in a period of time, an historical period, when half of humanity lives in cities. And they say, sociologists, analysts, they say that by 2030, it could be 70% of world's population living in cities. So urban populations have zero strategic food depth and depend entirely on fragile supply chains. As the BRICS urbanize faster than anyone else, what does this mean for food security, for social stability, for the kind of capitalism capitalism that can actually survive the 21st century? How do you think? What can you say?
It's a good question.
People
Yes.
moving from rural sides,
exactly.
from rural areas to cities.
Yeah, but this is the key question today, because the word today is a urban word.
Yeah.
The classical agrarian question was the question discussed by Marx, by Engels, by Lenin, by Preobrazhensky, by Bukharin in the 20th century Russia, was an agrarian question of an agrarian word. Today, I call the agri-food question because it's about a urban word, not an agrarian word anymore. So, for example, the United Nations, they project global urbanization to around 60% by the 2030 and 2/3 by 2050. So the numbers are
Growing.
somewhat contested, but the direction of the question is absolutely right, because humanity is becoming an urban species, as I told, and this changes the food question. Other cities, they do not feed themselves automatically. They depend on continuous flow of grain, of meats, vegetables, energy, fertilizers, water, credit, labor, cold chain, refrigeration, transport, retail platforms, waste systems. So if those flows are interrupted, urban stability deteriorates very quickly. So food security in an urbanized world as we live today is not only about producing enough food. It is about the resilience of the whole, let's say, social, natural metabolism connecting the countryside and the city.
In the city.
This is the central argument of my chapter 10, my last chapter of my book. The point is that the rural is not the outside of the city. It is inside. It is the inside of city survival. Urban life depends on soils, on water, on biodiversity, on rural labor, on logistics corridors, on storage system, on public regulations. So if these relations are governed only by cost minimization, by corporate efficiency, cities become vulnerable. COVID has showed this very clear. During the pandemics, everything became like under vulnerability.
Very fragile.
So very fragile. Huh? The same in situations of wars, like in Ukraine and Russia, which are major suppliers. In the Middle East, where are the main choke points of energy, with climate shocks, the same. So urban food security is exposed simultaneously to ecological, to logistic, to financial, to geopolitical risks. For the BRICS, food security is not only about farms. It is about logistics, land protection, technology, management of consumption. So India faces huge cities, persistent rural poverty, and a vast distribution system essential for social stability. Brazil is an agribusiness superpower, yet hunger returned in recent years with Bolsonaro government. Russia have a food security system which is like very strategic for geopolitically for national security. So the key is this: what kind of capitalism can feed urban societies without destroying the ecological and social foundations on which food depends? A purely neoliberal capitalism cannot do it, because it treats food as a commodity, as assumed supply chain will self-correct the market problems, the market failures. So a corporate green capitalism is also insufficient, because it may reduce environmental management while leaving controls, profits, and risks concentrated. It can produce, I'd say, sustainable labels, but not necessarily resilient food systems. What is needed is a more embedded form of development, one that treats food infrastructures as public and strategic, not merely private and commercial. So, give my last word about that. It is that the rural development is not more a residual agenda anymore. It is the institutional hinge of food security in urbanized society. The future is not rural against urban or local against global. The real question is how to reconnect production, consumption, and nature. So my answer to finish here is urbanization makes food security more urgent, not less. The more urban we become, the more we need to be conscious about planning this urban rural metabolism. So the capitalism that will eventually survive the 21st century will have to feed cities, reproduce nature, and maintain social legitimacy all at the same time. So if it cannot do these three things together, it will not be a stable and nice civilization for us or those who come after us to live in. I finish with these words.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this conversation. Thank you very much. Dear friends, food, land, and sovereignty are not just academic topics. They are the fault lines of the world we are living in today. So keep an eye on Professor's book, The BRICS and the Global Agri-Food System, coming soon. When will please tell our viewers about this book, when it will be on the bookshelves?
It is now under production by Routledge. It will be published probably in the middle of the next semester of 2026. Yeah, still this year, I hope.
Perfect, Professor. And I invite you for the next discussion as soon your book will be published, so we can read and discuss it one more time. And I invite our viewers, listeners, to read the book and prepare questions for you, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. It will be awesome.
Thank you.